is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, rethink your relationship with time, embrace finitude, and transform your life. I am speaking with journalist and author Oliver Burkeman. He's the author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. He wrote a long-running weekly column on psychology for The Guardian. This column will change your life, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Psychologist, and New Philosopher. 4,000 Weeks is one of my absolute favorite books. I have recommended this book and gifted it to so many people. Oliver Burkeman is brilliant. His writing is beautiful, profound, and this book is just phenomenal. I myself have read it several times, and every time I delight in reading it. One of the biggest insights of the book is the power of embracing our finitude, the limited time we all have on this earth. The book challenges our understanding of time and productivity. And Oliver invites us to rethink how we use our days and priorities. In this conversation, we discuss practical strategies for embracing our limitations, letting go of perfectionism, and finding deeper meaning in the moments we have. I hope this conversation will help you change your relationship with time, focus on what matters, and ultimately live a good and meaningful life. If you enjoyed this discussion, you might find these past episodes particularly interesting as well. Here are a couple of my favorites that dive deeper into similar topics. Episode 358, How to Beat Distraction, Expand Your Time, and Focus on What Matters, with Casey Holmes, author of Happier Hour, another fantastic book. And episode 352, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving, with brilliant Celeste Headley, and her book, author of Do Nothing, a phenomenal book. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Well, I so appreciate you taking the time. Speaking of time, I really value it. And I think your book is one of my favorite books, like maybe of all time. And I read a lot. I read a lot. It's so poetic and lyrical, and your words, the way that you string the words together is incredible. And I am sure many people have told you you're such a brilliant writer. And I think this book, I recommended it to so many people. Among a couple of other books, Greg McKeown's book, Essentialism,
yep.
Right? It's like it pairs very well with yours.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Right? Cal Newport's book, Deep Work.
Definitely.
Definitely. There is another book, an author I interviewed. I thought, wow, this is along the same lines. It's a fairly new book. This year it came out in March. It's called Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide.
Ringing a bell. What's the name of the author?
Yes, his name is Samir Chopra.
Right. Yeah, I got to say, I haven't got that book. I haven't read it yet. Sounds like my kind of book, though. Yeah.
It is. It's very much aligned with your philosophy, but he talks about more from this existential anxiety, angst that we all have, and we have to make peace with that. And that you talk about time, he covers a different angle. And I think it pairs so well with your book.
Oh, I'll check it out. I mean, we're all often the sort of nominal lens that you're using, right? Time, anxiety, focus. These are all just different approaches to the same core stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you're right. Like I've interviewed so many of these authors, and it seems like we're all talking about the same thing, but it's like music. There is only 7 notes, but you can sing so many songs, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally.
I love that. You also quote one of my favorite authors who I had an opportunity to interview on the podcast, Bruce Tift.
Ah,
You quote him a couple of times in the book, and I love his book too, Already Free.
yeah. And I think actually, I probably quote, I think what I do at least 2 points in the book is quote him, use the same line from him like twice because it's so important and it so sort of broke something open for me. Yeah, that sort of sense of experiencing reality as claustrophobic or constraining or imprisoning. I think it's so easy to get into that. Everyone has their own specific weird issues and hang-ups and neuroses and problems. And it's quite a skill that he definitely has to be able to sort of tunnel through to the things that are universal in all of those things. Otherwise, sure, it's good to have a book for people who have an issue with anger and good to have a book for people who have an issue with depression, but it's amazing if you can really like write to all those people at once, and he can really do that. Yeah,
I agree. I love his book and I read it multiple times. What books, now since we're talking about books, are you reading any books now, or you're busy writing your own? What books, like 5 books in the past maybe 10 years that you read that made an impact on you?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know if I've got a sort of ready-made answer. I have been working on another book, and during that process, when I'm really in it, I quite often end up reading sort of books that have nothing to do with my field of interest, right? So just sort of pure pleasure kind of detective novels or books about espionage or something, right? But if we're going to talk mainly about the books that are in the field of what we're discussing, I mean, one writer that I always want to mention when I'm asked that kind of question is James Hollis, the Jungian psychotherapist and writer, because his books have made a really big impact on me. I do mention him in my book, more than one of my books as well. He has a book called Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, which I came across was my sort of way into his work. He's amazing. He's now in his mid-80s and he's still writing and publishing. I would really suggest sort of any of his books if I were recommending them. Let me see. Let me try and think of a few more books. I just the book I just finished writing draws on at a number of points. Big book by a German sociologist called Hartmut Rosa, whose book is called Resonance, and it's really a book of sociology. It's a book about the subtitle is A Sociology of Our Relationship to the World. It really gets at something very important about the sort of feeling of aliveness that is at the heart of a meaningful and satisfying life, and how easy it is to lose track of that because we think that certain circumstances or certain activities or are actually at the core of meaning. And he's really zeroing in on this idea that there's a kind of vibrancy that you can actually write about quite rigorously. I mean, it's there in all sorts of writing, but what I love about his work is that he really sort of is writing about it in quite a scholarly way, but he's writing about this kind of aliveness and vibrancy, which we all sort of intuitively know when it's in our lives and when it's not in our lives. We'll rattle through 3 quick more. I really like a book by a spiritual writer called Joan Tollefson, which is called Death, the End of Self-Improvement. It's just brilliant. Even the title is just brilliant, but actually it's a really good book and she's a wonderful writer. It's in that sort of vein of spiritual books about sort of stepping more fully into the present moment, but she has a way of doing it which is very much not sentimentalist. It's very much not just about stepping into the moment when you're in a beautiful natural environment or something, or gazing into the eyes of a newborn baby. It's all about like just life in all, the exhaust fumes and the, all the things that go wrong in the course of a day and the muck and, and I really find that very empowering attitude. That was 3. Do you want 5 or shall I stop there?
You can stop there. I haven't read those books, I have to say. Now, I'm glad I asked this question. It sounds like I would very much enjoy your suggestions. And speaking of James Hollis, I was going to ask you that question. He has a powerful question you write about towards the end of the book, right? In your practical advice section. Maybe we can start with that. When we face serious questions questions in life, right? Choices. He asks a very powerful question.
Yeah, I love that I've turned into an evangelist for this question because it really does seem to resonate with a lot of people. But to be very clear, it's his and not mine. I mean, the idea is that you ask of yourself if you're facing a big choice or if you want to sort of make sense of whether you're on the right track in life or something like that, whether this choice or this experience enlarges you or diminishes you. Instead of asking, will this make me happy? Is this making me happy? Would this choice make me happy? Partly because we're very bad at predicting what's going to make us happy. Partly because there's a kind of happiness that doesn't really seem like it was worth it afterwards, right? There's a kind of cheap, superficial pleasure that we sometimes go for. What I love about that enlargement versus diminishment thing is that it really enables you to distinguish between different kinds of difficulty and trouble and suffering, right? So one of the examples I feel like resonate with a lot of people is just, you think about relationship problems, right? Problems in a marriage or something. There is a certain category of those which really are red flags that you should like leave that relationship. But there's a whole other category of them which are just like, yeah, it's called growing up and maturing and becoming a more sort of integrated person. And you don't want to go through your life running scared of that kind of difficulty, because then you will never have, deeper, meaningful relationships. And that question of enlargement is so useful that in those contexts, because for a lot of people anyway, and for me, it just connects intuitively. You're like, oh yes, right. Yeah, I get it. This is one of those things which is enlarging and is worth sticking with and is worth going through. It's the same with work. It's up in parenting, certainly, things that are not fun, but you can see that they are meaningful and that you're glad you're getting to do them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like this visceral sense you have when you ask that question. It's you orient immediately. When you say, is this going to make me happy? You can even make a bad choice. I feel like it's such a superficial question. I just turned 50, a few days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And, the way people were congratulating me, some people are like, wow, you lived a half a century. I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds like so much. And then I'm like, how many weeks is that based on Oliver Berkman's work? And I'm asking,
don't do that some. Yeah.
Don't do that. It was so shocking. It's 2,600.8 weeks. And clearly it's, I have less time left, even if I'm optimistic. It was quite depressingly shocking at first, but then I said, it's just meaningless. I'm not going to obsess over this number. But when you truly, time is an interesting phenomenon, right? When you think of it as years, hours, weeks, decades, it just changes your perception. It either diminishes the time you have or enlarges. If you say weeks, 4,000 weeks, it's like, oh my gosh, hurry up, it's running out. You get that urgency, you feel that finitude that you talk about. But when you say you have 80 years to live, it's like, you relax a little more because it's 80 years. It's just so interesting. When it comes to time, I feel like perception matters so much, or our understanding of it.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I mean, look, it's a title of a book. It's quite possible. It's quite possible that you're not halfway through your weeks. By the way, I'm like less than 2 years behind you on that. Yeah, you must have been born just a little earlier in the 1970s than I was. And of course, on the other level of it, a grand piano could fall out of a tall building next week. Although the title of the book, I think, is a bit stress-inducing, and in hindsight, that was probably a commercially good thing, right? It's like sort of panics you a little bit. Hopefully not too much, so that you run away from the book. I think where I want to go with that idea ultimately, you're right that perception really matters, but where I want to go with that idea ultimately is that actually we are so finite and life is so short and we are so limited that you can get to a place where that's very relaxing, right? If life is fairly limited and you want to try to pack everything in, that's really hard. But when you realize that packing everything in is impossible, that's an interesting transition, because then you're like, oh, okay. And your shoulders can fall a little bit and you can exhale and you can say, okay, it was never on the cards to pursue all the ambitions that I had, or to live in all the places I'd like to live, or to experience all the forms of work that whatever it is. And I think that's ultimately very relaxing for people sort of seeking a meaning for their lives and a purpose, because then you sort of are free to just, with care and attention and pleasure, do a handful of things in your life, rather than frenetically fighting this impossible struggle to fit everything in. So I hope that the message is actually quite relaxing, even though the title is not.
No, I find the title very compelling. I actually love the title and the cover of the book. The hardcover is different than the paperback. This Greek person, whatever, this god for time, God holding the clock. And obviously time management for mortals is like, yes, we're mortals, and it's kind of ironic, time management, but it's not really a book about time management, like in a traditional sense that you would get from a book. I really love the title. I think it's very clever and makes you think about it. But I agree. For me, it's a liberating choice. When I think about this finite time that we have on this earth, it's so relaxing and liberating to live and enjoy fully, and enjoy relationships, people fully, not to take it for granted, and awaken to the beauty and challenges of life. Because it's a package, it's all. You can't just seek pleasure and happiness. I feel like it's so liberating. But then I saw something, I think philosophically it's liberating, but when I see it concretely, I saw this podcaster, author, medical doctor, Peter Attia. You know him. He has a wall calendar, a large one, that is the weeks of his life. It's the 4,000 weeks. And he marks every week when, he finishes the week. And I find that stressful. That I don't find liberating. The idea I find liberating, but like seeing visually is stress inducing. What do you think about those calendars?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I certainly don't like sort of criticize anyone for using them if they find it to be motivating and focusing. I do think that can't quite work out why this should be something that happens when you visualize it rather than when you just think about it. But there is some phenomenon whereby you sort of, what's the right way of putting it? I guess I'm going to slightly repeat myself, but maybe in a useful way. Something about boxes on a page makes me want to do everything I can to cram as much into those boxes. And really, I think that ultimately what I'm pointing to, by far not the only person to do this, right? It's in all sorts of books and spiritual approaches and all sorts, is to sort of collapse all that down into a single point, and to collapse that all down into the present moment in some sense. Not that we shouldn't have an eye on the future and pursue goals and things, but that in the end, our finitude, our limitation is such that is so great that, it isn't a question of rigorously and stress-inducingly trying to sort of make the best use of each moment and sort of get them all under our belt, because like, for what? If it's all going to stop anyway. And I think Peter Attia specifically has been really open about the fact that like some of his initial motivation for all the stuff that he does is kind of like fear of death. And I don't think I have somehow reconciled myself to my mortality at all through the process of, maybe I've edged a little bit along that road, but this is what we're all dealing with to some extent. And so there's something quite honest, I think, about those people who are willing to be like, yeah, this is the poster on the wall. I'm trying to make the most of these days. Yeah, for me, there's a certain kind of urgency feeling that is my least favorite feeling in the world, really. And I don't, find a whole bunch of sort of personal development people who talk about how important it is to cultivate a sense of urgency. And I'm like, no, I don't need any more urgency in my life. I need less. But I think we are all ultimately pointing towards the same things, probably.
Yeah. That sense of urgency gives me so much panic. I try to eliminate that as much as possible, the urgency. But sometimes I say to my teenager, I'm like, you have no sense of urgency. And I'm like, ouch, why did I say that? That's not good.
Well, I'm interested what you think the cause of your dislike of it is, because for me, I think it's really clear that urgency is completely wrapped up in my deep psyche with sort of other people's agendas and other people needing stuff from me, or other people being disappointed if I don't do things properly and all this stuff. And that's not really about urgency. That's about whether you're living for your own values or you're trying to sort of be a people pleaser. And as a sort of recovering people pleaser, I tend to think of myself as maybe there's a future for me in which urgency is fine, because it's the urgency of what I want to do here on this planet rather than the urgency of trying to meet obligations.
Yeah, yeah.
The sense of obligation has played a very big role in my life, and I'm happy that it's reducing somewhat.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. It depends how and where you grew up. Like I can say that too. I grew up in the Soviet Union, in Armenia. Yeah, that sense of obligation is instilled through shame, right? Then you develop that you are responsible for other people's happiness and everything. You please people, you help, you overextend yourself to the cost of neglecting yourself. And
right.
In your 40s, you realize, wait a minute, this is the wrong way of living life. And you start to change.
Oh, and yeah, how that works, what the role of the sort of collectivist society is in that as well is a fascinating, like, that's a whole sort of state-imposed notion that it's for other people instead of for yourself as well, I guess.
But I think as I'm getting older and I'm living my life in the United States and I'm married to an American and my daughter is completely very American, I am noticing trends here that I dislike, right? The individualistic tendencies. And there is something to be said about caring for others and being part of the collective. Yes, there was heavy obligation, but if I don't care about my neighbor and don't give a crap about, people in my community, then that's not a good society.
No, totally. Yeah, it's easy to conclude that like both of these value systems, especially imposed sort of at a societal level, just fail in the end, and that to sort of believe there must be a way in which actually, and I think that we have experiences of this in our lives, right? They may not be all the time, but that there doesn't need to be an opposition here between doing what is most deeply satisfying to yourself and being a real part of being a helpful member of a community. The trouble is it then leads you to think that maybe this can only be handled in sort of at the scale of the Amish or something, and we just need to go back to kind of agrarian societies. Maybe nothing can. I don't know where that leads politically, but I think I totally see the point you're making about the extremes of that.
If I were to choose today, knowing what I know about life and how I turned out, I would choose the collectivist approach more than the individualistic. I would still choose to be raised in that way. But of course, the balance of two is what I value today. And I think I am able, only at age 50, to help others without neglecting myself,
right?
Not to the expense of my own happiness and develop anger and resentment. I do both now, but it took me a lifetime to learn, right? Can we learn this earlier and faster? And what's the secret to that? Like in terms of parents, what can we do? How can we raise children, to care about other people, but not to an extent that they are forgetting themselves or they're putting their needs on a back burner. I don't want that type of a child.
Yeah.
But I do want a child who cares about others and is helpful and is reaching and, and it's just a hard balance. I figured out for myself, but I have a hard time instilling that as a parent.
Right. Yeah. No, I really understand that. And I'd love any tips that you have, that you've come up with. I mean, I think one thing that occurs to me there, I think that an important point here that sort of where these two topics come together is that doing the sort of this is a thing that lots of sort of Jungian therapists and people will say, but I kind of I'm an amateur Jungian therapist, not a therapist on any level, but I'm sort of a hanger on in that world. The sort of inner work that you're talking about, having gone through yourself, and that you do through your work and through this podcast and all sorts of other things, and I do when I'm writing stuff, like that is actually sort of a gift to your children, to deal with your stuff in that way, to make it less of an issue that you impose upon them, either the sort of, individualistic satisfaction that you denied yourself, or your sort of rather tortured sense of obligation that you're going to make them justify by having them emulate it. Or Jung, famously said somewhere that the greatest burden the child must bear is the unlived life of the parent, which is a great quote, and it's a good reason why why people shouldn't feel too bad about working, why women, because it falls on them more, this dilemma, shouldn't feel bad about working, because if you're working in something where you're growing and fulfilling who you are, like that firstly, you're setting a good role model, obviously, but also you're just like, you're not creating all these kind of awful repressed goals and dreams in the world of the family. You're doing the thing you wanted to do, and it frees everyone up, I think, or I hope anyway. Our son is 7, and on the one hand, I'm always amazed at how much he combines those sort of individually focused and other focused things. But on the other hand, he's 7, so I understand that parenting teenagers is a different ball game.
No, I have to say I'm enjoying the teenage years very much. People always ask me, "Oh, you have a teenager? Oh, I'm so sorry." I'm like, "No, I actually enjoy being a parent to a teenager. It's amazing." Well, my daughter is 16. 16 is a different than 14, and different than 12, 13. So every year has its own challenges, but I'm finding the teenage years super exciting, because you get to talk and communicate and hear this person, you're like, who is this person? The way they think is different than you, and you have to be open and curious, obviously, for that. And also I am lucky in the sense that we share similar temperament, similar interests, and I think the way I parented her, right? No punishments, no rewards, more conscious way, the way I preach on the podcast, it pays off at the end. It does pay off. You raise an individual, and it's interesting, to be with them like another human being. It's a relationship like just other relationships. It's fantastic.
Excellent. I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, it's a testament to your parenting, but I'm very glad to hear that it might even be on the cards for.
Yes, definitely. I say that not to boast, but to give people hope to stay on the path of parenting, with more consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always, I think it's so interesting because so much of the wider discourse about parenting and kids at the moment is so much about problems and hazards, as it should be and always will be. It's not a thing in it, it's not necessarily a problem in itself that's how it goes. But there's a certain kind of person and temperament, and I think I am one of them, who doesn't really benefit from, for example, being told to savor time with children, because then I just get very self-conscious about whether I'm savoring it enough. I've even noticed how, there's all this pushback against sort of helicopter parenting and very, very sort of micromanaging parenting in favor of, free range, risk-taking parenting. But even that, you see people sort of worrying, like, am I doing it enough? Like, am I letting my kids run freely enough? And the parents in my own life who I really admire actually have just sort of understood that it's not about finding one specific philosophy and then making sure you don't diverge from it at any moment. And sometimes I just have this amazing, it strikes me with the force of an extraordinary thing. Every now and again, I interact with my son. I have the thought like, oh, maybe I'm actually going to raise a securely attached kid. Like, who knew? And maybe not. Maybe there's all sorts of troubles in the future, but it's like it's almost amazing sometimes just to think like, oh, maybe this is maybe things are okay here because we're so conditioned to go the other direction.
Yeah, I think it's our own anxiety and fear gets in the way of parenting and living a life more. And yes, kids will be fine. We are doing, a better job than our parents did. And I think we're just overthinking. If you ask me about parenting, we're overthinking, over parenting, over crafting, over, from our own anxieties for sure. But if we can make peace with those anxieties, and that's why I like that term from Bruce Tift, his book, already free. We are already free. Things are already fine. Things are okay. Our life is finite. Our time is finite. Can we relax and just have an experience? Not necessarily, achieve and perform and optimize everything, including parenting, but just being. But with being, you can also have some goals, right? You can't go to other extreme. I see the extremes and it's never great. When you become overly performative and or overly laissez-faire where you just neglect everything and you're like, we're just being and flowing with the flow. Like there should be some kind of balance.
Do hear stories about people who sort of taking unschooling to the extreme where their kids can't read at age 10 or whatever, and just some kids struggle with reading, but not for that reason, for the reason that they haven't even had the opportunity. What I love about Bruce Tift's work and a number of other things I've read, but especially that book Already Free, is he's not set, it's sort of that book is comes from two radical angles, and one of them is everything's fine. And the other is you've got processes you need to go through and growth you need to do. And it reminds me, there's that famous quote attributed to some modern day Buddhist teacher. I forget, but it's that line, each of you is perfect and you could all use a little improvement. And it's holding those two perspectives and not rejecting them because they're paradoxical. That's what Tift is so good at, I think.
Yeah, I think that's it. You nailed it, right? We get so overly obsessed with one extreme, polarization. I think holding paradoxes in life is a skill, and life is a paradox, right? There's so many paradoxes in life. Being comfortable with that, developing that skill, I think is more important than, fighting against it or choosing one way and doing it hard. Let's talk about time as a resource. Is it helpful to think of time as a resource, or it's not?
Well, again, this is sort of another example of this. It's both kind of perspective, or what the Zen people would call the absolute and the relative and all this. I write in the book about how the whole idea, time is something that you use. There is this relationship where there's you and then there's your time. And maybe you feel like you're fighting against it, or you're making really good use of it, or you're making bad use of it, or it's hounding you. All of these different experiences of time in the modern world depend on this notion that there's you and then there's time and there's a separation there. And I try to sort of imaginatively reconstruct what it might have been like for somebody in pre-industrial Europe, say, right, medieval times, for whom I think that distinction would not have existed. The notion that we sort of go through life subliminally lining up our tasks against a schedule or a calendar or a little yardstick. We have these different images that pass through our minds, and they're all these kind of spatial metaphors for are we fitting enough stuff into our lives? Is there enough time to do certain things? And in a social context where small scale agriculture is all that anybody does, this just doesn't arise, because you have instead this form of life that anthropologists call task orientation, where, the rhythms of life just emerge from the things you have to do. And I think people experience this, just to make a specific point about parenting. I think people often experience this in the very, very first days weeks with a newborn baby. It can be incredibly difficult and utterly exhausting. And if it's as exhausting as it was for me as a dad, I can't even barely get inside what it really must be like for a mother. But time, it isn't regimented by the clock usually, unless you're trying to get your kid onto a sleep schedule very soon or something. It's just like, when a need arises, the need must be met. And whether that's sleep or food or pooping or, whatever it is, it's just like these things just happen, and you do what is needed when they happen. And there's something about that is very relaxing is the wrong word, right? Because it's utterly exhausting. But there's something that is it feels very sort of just kind of conflict free in a way, maybe is a way of putting it. There isn't a psychic battle going on between, what should I choose to do right now? How can I make my day more efficient so I can get through all the things? There is a kind of lack of alienation, I suppose, between the person and time. I think that is what it would have been like for most people in pre-industrial times. Again, in many ways, absolutely terrible lives. It's not that they had a nice time, that particular kind of feeling of being hounded by time wouldn't have been present. So back to your question about resources, I think we all have to treat time as a resource. We all have to think, how am I going to organize the day or the week to do all the things I want to do, or at least some of them. In organizations, you absolutely have to really be thinking about time as a resource. But I think it's really useful to keep in the back of your mind the fact that it's kind of a construct, right? It's not true in some ultimate sense that you have this thing called time that you have to use. Actually, you're just here now. And then in the next moment, you're just here now. And you can do whatever feels like the most important or useful or pleasurable thing to do with each moment. And that's basically all that's going on. Everything else to do with planning and forecasting and scheduling is a sort of an overlay.
Yeah, we are time, you write in the book. I find that very enlightening. When we have the newborn baby, right? If they have their own needs and we respond to them. But unfortunately, I have to say the doctors tell you to feed them on a schedule right from the beginning, instead of letting us be in the flow of figuring things out and meeting the child's need and being more present, which would be good for parents who went through this difficult time of delivering a baby. And it's stressful to have a baby, right? You don't sleep and all of that. But if you now have to worry about feeding schedule and pooping schedule and, sleep schedule, that's so not natural and induces more stress in people.
And it sets up a whole new way for things to be wrong, right? I mean, like, things can go wrong in the early days of a baby's life, and you need doctors paying attention to that. And I'm not someone who's going to start saying it should all be done intuitively and instinctively and not involve the medical establishment, right? But you want to be careful with, and I don't know anything really about life on the maternity ward except for the few days that I was involved in that. But there is this way that we, in all walks of life, in all areas of life, sort of set up temporal structures that things are supposed to work on, and then feel really bad and stressed when they don't, regardless of the question of whether they actually need in themselves to be on that temporal structure. And, clearly many billions of children have lived and flourished in the history of the world without those specific temporal structures at specific times. Yeah.
Are you still fascinated by this notion of time, or it has diminished, or maybe you have newfound angle?
No, I think I'm still pretty obsessed with it. I think it's like the way I've understood. I mean, and the things people write about are the things that they have difficulty with, right? It's not because I've always been really wise about my time that I want to write about it. It's because it's always felt like a big problem, and I want to try to work out some answers. I think I've maybe shifted a little bit, certainly with the book of short essays that I've just finished writing. The emphasis is a bit more on the general notion of sort of limitation and finitude in all sorts of ways, not only like how short an amount of time we have to be alive, but also how little control we get to exert over things and how little we can really know or understand about what's going on in the world. And so it's kind of limitation on all fronts instead of time. But again, I think these are just, in a way, they're just sort of a lot of books get written, including my own, with a particular angle, because if they didn't have that angle, the title of the book would just have to be like, "This is my philosophy of life at the moment," you know, and that wouldn't be a saleable proposition. Finding different kind of different way angles to sort of get at that in ways that are more vivid for other people.
Yeah. What have you changed since the book came out and, you did all this research? What is one idea you changed or think that you acquired a skill in regards to time, productivity, time management that like I used to be this way, but as a result of writing this book and doing all the podcasts and interviews, like I'm more relaxed or I've changed? Is there like a before and after when it comes to that topic?
Yeah, to some extent there is. I mean, I really felt when I was writing it, like it always goes with me with writing. I don't know how universal this experience is, but like I come up with a really sort of interesting or idea that is interesting to me, and feel like I have a good intellectual grasp of it. But then during the process of writing the book, I almost have to kind of change my personality a bit to live into it. Otherwise, apart from anything else, I'd just be a huge hypocrite, right? So I sort of see the problem and then I want to sort of live my way into the solution. So I sort of can't finish a book like that unless I've changed a bit, because on some level, the book is the process of changing, working out how to be in a different way. Still totally a work in progress, but I definitely think I'm definitely a little bit more trusting of sort of intuitive ways of living in time and of acting. I'm less about the ceaseless quest for the perfect system of task management and scheduling and folder organization and all of the rest of it. I've sort of seen that there isn't a perfect one, and that none of them are going to spare you the fact that you do have to make tough decisions with your time, and that you won't get to do everything, and that you'll probably let people down and all the rest of it. Of course, becoming a parent and writing this book sort of happened at the same time, considered over only a couple of years of that was I writing the book properly, but period where I was thinking about these issues and the book was coming to life was also the period where I became a parent. So who knows which bit of this, how the causality works. But, as anyone who's a parent knows, it's a good reminder that your control over things is limited. It's a good reminder that you wouldn't even want total control, right? That all sorts of the best things happen through what can't be controlled. And, I'm someone who has the good fortune to have a lot of autonomy over how I organize my time. What a foolish thing it would be to set up a really rigid schedule on top of that prevented me from, spending lots of time with the family. So I do struggle with that because I like my work and I'm ambitious for my work. And so I do experience really wanting to spend lots of time working and really wanting to spend lots of time doing things that aren't work as a tension. But I think you get better at navigating that when you sort of realize that there isn't a perfect solution to it. There couldn't be.
There is no work-life balance. That's a made up.
Right. And work-life balance can be it could be a very stress-inducing idea, right? It's like, no, I'm either going to end up spending less time than I theoretically could as a sort of active present parent, or less time than I theoretically could working, or both. It's just like, it's the way it's going to go. And also it doesn't have to be like one way forever. You can have seasons and periods like that.
Yeah, definitely agree. But do you think this kind of thinking, what you said earlier about not finding the right schedules and productivity tools and things like that, do you think this is specific to midlife? As we age and we approach midlife, our priorities shift, or we are wiser, we understand more things, and we realize like this is not a good battle, and we sort of think differently about the time we have left, and we get sick and we lose people, our parents vanish. And do you think, we change our perspectives on life and time and productivity as we approach or when we are in midlife?
Yeah, definitely. I think on some level, this is sort of the elephant in the room, right? It's like I'm in the book and in conversations like this, I'm putting a way of thinking about time that on some level contrasts with the societal mainstream. But on another level, a lot of this is life cycle related. I think, it's not a coincidence that all the people on YouTube telling you to have the sort of perfect morning routine and dominate the day and sort of
master your time.
Yeah, they often tend to be sort of in their 20s and often tend to be male. Perhaps, there's a whole gendered side to this, but also very much an age side to it. And, there are great books. I don't know if you've come across David Brooks's book, The Second Mountain, but he's written quite eloquently on this idea that, well, okay, it's not that one of these is bad, right? It's that the experience that one has, and this is certainly an experience I had, is that ways of living that served you really well stop serving you really well at a certain point, because you pursue them as far as they'll go. And maybe my obsession with productivity and efficiency in an earlier part of my adulthood helped me in lots of ways in my career, but there comes a point where it's time to sort of reevaluate that, and where you need to move into a second stage of things. I think that was what was really meant in the very first idea of the midlife crisis, right? Which has become a bit of a joke idea, but I think in its origins in psychology. So then the question does arise a little bit for those of us who are, writing books and creating podcasts and everything. Well, like, isn't this just something that people have to get to for themselves? Like, what's the purpose of writing about it if it's just something you have to go through? And I've gone back and forth on that, but I do think that in my case, I've heard from enough people who are much younger than me and who found this stuff to resonate, that people can be ready for that transition at lots of different points in their chronological life, right? You can be in your 20s and ready to start reevaluating things, or maybe it's going to wait until you're in your 70s for that to hit you.
Yeah, definitely agree on that one. It depends on your life experiences and circumstances. I experienced a severe earthquake at age 13, lost everything, and my time perception, valuing life, the finitude, it was implanted right then and there. It just shifted everything. So books like yours are very comforting and validating and resonate deeply. It goes with my life's experience, having gratitude and accepting it all, that this may disappear at any moment, and it's okay. I find that, you are right. Everybody gets to that at some point. But yes, there is still an importance for you and everyone else to write those books. And like you said, you also write for yourself, right? It's helpful.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think sometimes one of the most powerful things I think that a good book, it's not for me to say mine is a good book, but when I read a good book, one of the most powerful things that it can do when it's done well is to sort of give people permission to think thoughts they were already thinking on some level, right? It's not that I'm going to implant into your brain for the first time ever that you should make a career break or be willing to let certain things go in life or something. It's that you've been getting there yourself, and it's useful to have somebody sort of reflect that back to you and explain how that might work.
The way you talk about the concepts is like, yeah, maybe I vaguely thought about it, but you have this sharp focused view, and you thought about it so much that you distill it in one sentence, in one expression. It's like, boom, that's it. It just brings all of your lived experience in one sentence. And so it's very helpful to read books, because you probably vaguely thought about it, but haven't thought enough to put it in a concise format. But people like you, dedicate years in thinking about these subjects. And I find that really remarkably enlightening when you come across an idea that resonates so deeply, like that idea, but not that well,
I think that's true. I think it's how I benefit from books as a reader too. And yeah, I think that sort of thing about distilling something down into its conceptual outlines is that's the thing I bring to the party. That's the thing I've always enjoyed doing and been quite good at. So, yeah.
You do it so well, so well. I read your book multiple times. I'm going to ask you one last question about the to-do lists and the done lists, which Gretchen Rubin calls it to-do lists. I don't know if you're familiar with that, making a to-do list, the things that you've already accomplish during the day. There's the to-do and the ta-da, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that terminology. Yeah, I've thought a lot about lists. Maybe that's a little bit tragic as a way of spending your life, but I have. And I think there's a lot of power in a good list, but we also tend to sort of drive ourselves crazy by using them for multiple things. One of the ways that I write about that in the book is it's very useful to separate off lists as storage of all the things you have thought of that you might want to do or need to do from any list that you're actually committing to doing. So there's a good benefit in having a kind of a long list and then a very short list that you take items from the long list and put them onto the short list. And those are the ones you're committed to doing. But then a done list, right, is the idea of a list that you write things on once you have done them. And the big difference here is that whenever you're working with a to-do list, you're constantly calling to mind all the things that are left to do. And that's basically infinite, right? I mean, your to-do list is not infinite. It might have 20 items on it. It might have 200 items on it. But in principle, if somebody gave you another 200 years of life, you would find useful things to do with them. So whenever you're looking at a to-do list, you're sort of always projecting into that future of like, well, there's all this stuff that I haven't done yet. Whereas, of course, when you write down a list of things that you have done during the day, the sort of implicit comparison is with like, what if I hadn't done anything today? And so that's great, because then it's like, oh, wow, I've done 5 things compared to 0. That's amazing. Compared to infinity, it's obviously terrible, but any number compared to infinity is depressing. So depressingly small. So I think it's really useful, not necessarily a physical list. Sometimes people use task management software, and then it's just a question of keeping the finished tasks in one folder or one place somewhere on that so that you can look at them. And I still find that enormously consoling somehow, because it's so easy to just forget the moment you've done something. It's like you never did it. It's like, okay, that's great, but the most important thing is the thing I haven't yet done. And actually, no, it's good to be able to look back on a day and see that you did some things.
Yeah. And what advice would you give yourself, like knowing what you know now before you even started writing your column in The Guardian? What advice you may give yourself, words of wisdom or maybe an insight?
It's very hard because sometimes I think about like what I would have said to a much younger version of me, maybe even before that, when I was a university student or something. And it would definitely have been in the vein of, chill out. It would definitely have been in the vein of like, these things are not as important as you're making them, that actually you can do an enormous amount of really great things because you don't feel that you have to do them, right? Not because like some disaster is going to happen if you don't perform well, but actually you can sort of say to yourself, I don't need to perform well, but I'm going to because it's fun, right? And then there is actually this way of living an accomplished life that doesn't rely on anxiety. And I think I'm working my way into it finally now. But I definitely have been an insecure overachiever, to use the official psychological jargon. I'm sure you have too, right? People who, based on what you said today, I mean, like people who do a lot and they're driven and everyone says like, well done, that's great. But deep down on some level, they're doing it because they feel inadequate, not because they just enjoy doing things. So I think I would have tried to get myself to snap out of that a bit. But as we've also discussed, to some extent, I expect you do have to go through it and that you can't just jump over the self-knowledge in the middle that comes from sort of taking that path in the first place.
But you know what? I wonder one thing. If we didn't have those inadequacies or insecurities, would we achieve and perform and master and create and find solutions to big problems? I'm so curious about that. I feel like most of human achievements come from lack and deprivation. This is my own little theory. That drive to get more, to get somewhere. Why do immigrants succeed in the United States and not the native people don't have the same, desire? So it's like, it's an interesting thing to think about.
Totally. Yeah. No, and
if you were to raise a child who is so, who has a sense of deep self-worth and secure attachment and things like that, what would that person create? Would they create from a happy place, or would they create more? I don't know. I would love to know that. But from what I know from my own lived experience, the things that I have accomplished and achieved didn't come from, it came from lack and deprivation always. They didn't come from.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question. And then the other question, of course, would be if somebody was completely happy and secure and felt great about themselves and they did not spend their lives creating lots of impressive things, like, does it even matter, right? They had a happy life. That's great. I suppose how I really think about this in my own, certainly as a parent myself, is I kind of think it's sort of like I'll cross that bridge if I ever come to it, right? It's like I expect that my son will receive so much sort of the anxiety that's in my genes and in my unconscious and that is sort of in the world at large, that like everything I can do to sort of
mitigate that,
counteract that is worth it. We're nowhere near the point where it slips over and there's just too much security and too much lack of anxiety. If I ever see any evidence of that, I'll start trying to instill feelings of urgency in him, and I don't know, make him feel anxious.
I think you might be right. I think you might be right about that. Yeah, I like that idea. I definitely do. Well, it's been such an enormous pleasure and honor to speak with you. And like I said, this is one of my absolute favorite books. I pick up anytime and just read a little passage, and it's so uplifting and orienting in life. It's like a little Bible for me in that sense. You know, I love books like this, philosophical in nature, yet really, rooted in life, not just like out there, but there is.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That means a lot.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been very thoughtful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You have a fantastic rest of your day.
I will do my best. All right. Thank you, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What are your biggest takeaways? Did you find this conversation useful? What resonated with you the most? How can you apply what you gleaned from this episode into your own life? I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website, authenticparenting.com/contact. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners, engage in meaningful conversations about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for people like you. Be sure to hit that follow button to never miss a new episode. If you enjoy the podcast, take a moment to rate or review it on the platform of your choice. Ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. When you write a review, it goes towards the entire podcast. Also, consider making a donation to show your support. Authentic Parenting is a free resource, and support for this podcast comes from listeners like you. This is an ad-free show, and we rely solely on your donations. To make a one-time or monthly donation, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. It means the world to me. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seawold. Thank you so much for listening.